Hello, welcome to the Communication 24/7 podcast, where we communicate about how we communicate. I'm your host, Jen Furlong. I have a special treat today. I am super excited about today's guest. Now, those of you who are longtime listeners, you know that my daytime job as a media analyst, I really get into the politics of things. I'm fascinated by how we communicate about politics, how it impacts how we communicate with one another, just being a consumer of communication. And so a very important aspect of that is campaigning. And I am so thrilled to be able to say that I have an expert with me today in political communication. Matt Krayton is founder of Publitics. It's a strategy firm, really, for politicians. Well, anything, I guess, related to politics. So we're going to listen to Matt explain a little bit about what he does with his firm. But then after we get to know him a little better, I want to do kind of a deep dive into just how are things going in our world today? And what are some strategies that maybe you and I can learn from Matt so that we can have better, more meaningful conversations about some of the more difficult topics that we're having to grapple with in our society today. So Matt, thank you so much for being on the show. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on, Jen. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So that was kind of a really quick, really broad. Here's Matt, and this is what he's doing today. Would you mind just introducing yourself to the listeners and letting them know exactly what is Publitics and what kind of relationship to the political sphere do you have?
Sure, absolutely. So Publitics is a full-service PR, public affairs, and political consulting firm. And as you noted, we focus a lot and think a lot about strategy, both for our political clients, nonprofit clients, and then things that I like to call political adjacent, which is almost everything these days. Everything is almost political adjacent. So we provide a variety of services for our clients, but cut our teeth in the political world. So I started back in 2011 by myself, solo practitioner. Poking around for whatever campaign would hire me at that point. So I was fresh out of grad school, had no idea what I was going to do. I had a job, didn't love it. And I was like, well, I've always liked politics, so let's try this. And luckily it's worked out over the years. So, I've been doing campaigns ever since. And that's really where I developed, my communication skills and some of the things that we bring to our clients, even in other sectors. You can learn a lot from political campaigns, both what to do and what not to do. And then in 2014, I brought on a partner, and we've been growing ever since. So he's also a political consultant as well. So he had traveled the country managing campaigns from the federal level on down. So that's sort of how we got our start. And now we're still doing a lot of campaign work, but then like I said, we're also doing a lot of work in sort of the political sphere, and then also corporate communications as well.
That's fantastic. So what were you like as a kid? Were you always into politics, or was this just something that developed later on?
That's an interesting question. So what was I like as a kid? I wasn't into politics per se. Like I didn't grow up in I think what you would consider to be like a hyper political family. And in fact, I kind of ended up on the opposite side of the spectrum of most of my family, though there's been some shuffling in recent years, as has been in a lot of different families. But I always did have this interest in history. So I was very lucky from a young age that my grandparents in particular helped me kind of nurture that interest in history. So for some reason, I really got into the Civil War era type stuff. So they took me on several trips to tour the battlefields and learn all about that stuff. So I always had this interest in history and how governments worked, and that ultimately translated. I would say like in high school, like I was interested in politics, paying attention, but again, not like a really hyper partisan person, not someone that was paying super close attention, other than reading the headlines and kind of consuming the news and politics that way. In college, definitely became more politically active and tried to learn. So I minored in political science, majored in history, which I guess was inevitable. I was actually my path. I was on a path to be a history teacher, actually a social studies teacher. So that was my thought. Leaving high school, getting into college, I'm like, all right, I like teaching, like history. Like, what can you even do with this? Like, so I was like, oh, I can teach. So, did that whole thing. Went through my undergrad, did a master's degree in education, and then 2008 came along. Economy melted down. I graduated in 2010 from undergrad, 2011 from grad school, and there were no jobs for teachers, especially history teachers, right? So that's where I was like kind of stuck, and I was like, all right, well, I have this degree, and I've developed this interest. And in grad school too, I actually had the opportunity to work for a public opinion polling institute at the university that I was at. So I got to kind of experience firsthand how people put together polls, how you gauge
I bet that was fascinating. Yeah.
It was fascinating, especially like the mechanics of it, because like you always, until you're like really paying attention, you don't really appreciate like all of the work and intricacies that go into it, and honestly, all of the challenges now today, which at that point even it would have been hard to imagine the world that we're in today. From just the pure difficulty of measuring public opinion on any given issue, let alone the horse race of a political campaign. So that was really fascinating, because we got to kind of dig into issues and sort of the psyche of the public to see where people were at on certain issues. So I had a lot of fun there, and that sort of like also cultivated my interest.
Yeah, yeah. Similarly, it's pretty funny. I think we don't develop our love for politics until much later. And it kind of like, you go down that windy road. I'm about to date myself here. So pretty much the same. Grew up in a family who we really didn't pay attention to politics like at all. I mean, my dad was like a drummer in a rock band, and my mom, after they were divorced, she was the biker chick. So, I mean, there was like a lot of partying going on, and just, that area of the world just was not even on the radar until I was graduating high school and realized, look, I mean, I don't have money to go to college. I have no idea what in the hell am I going to do. I'll join the military. And then being a woman who I went into the Marine Corps right out of high school, that was my first really just dipping my big toe into that pond, because I went into public affairs and I wound up at Quantico. And that was really, just kind of went into hyperdrive, lessons learned, the politics of what's going on, and being so close to Washington, D.C. And we had the tailhook trials going on at the same time. And we had the Lone Tree trial with, he was the first Marine to be accused of espionage. We had women who were being integrated into training, at the basic school in the Marine Corps. I mean, it was just boom, boom, boom. And it just opened up this world. I just found it so fascinating. And at the time, being a journalist, I was really in this position where I could just kind of go and just ask questions and learn about everything that was happening. And so I found that I became more of a student because I was a journalist in the Marine Corps, and I really just enjoyed the conversations and the learning and getting the different perspectives. And so now fast forward, I never in a million years would have thought I would have ended up being a media analyst, where I'm reading the news and working with other analysts from across the political spectrum. And it's amazing how you can kind of get sucked into it. And you really had no intent to do that. But, I had a question that, speaking of young adults and how, you and I are kind of examples of how we develop this appreciation for political communication over time. what have you learned in your studies over time? How are we able to reach out to young adults more effectively? Are there any tools that you've learned over time that are working better than others? Or is it just a matter of, you know what, they're young and we were all young and none of us really gave a crap about any of this, at that point in time? Or are young adults different today than what we were when we were younger?
Yeah, I mean, those are really good questions. So I think to start with the last part, I do believe that the generations that we consider like Gen Z, millennials at this point, though as a millennial, we're getting older.
That's right.
It's always funny because like sometimes you see these like lists of like top millennials and whatever, and it's like I think actually they might be confusing like millennial with just young person, which is like
Absolutely. I agree with you. Oh yeah.
yeah. We're like some of us are getting closer to a middle-aged person rather
Well,
than.
I'm Gen X. We're kind of like the invisible generation at this point.
Sure, yeah, the forgotten.
Right.
Jen, what was that? No, exactly.
Right. Gen X, what's that?
Oh no. So to answer your question, I think the answer is yes. Like younger people are becoming increasingly engaged to the level that I would like to see it. No, I don't think so. I mean, like I think political conversations, public policy conversations are extraordinarily important, not just for what happens today, but then what happens 20 years in the future. And ultimately, like younger voters are going to be the ones bearing the brunt of whatever decisions are made today. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that. The other thing that is a little bit different now is that there is almost like if you think back, so I kind of like grew up on the cusp of technology being just like so accessible 24/7. So like going into college, freshman year, Facebook was just starting to become a thing.
Mm.
But I also remember like dial-up internet where you could not be on the computer. If a telephone call came in, it would knock you off. It made that horrible, like,
That's right.
groaning sound.
Yeah.
And it's so funny making those references too. So I talk about dating myself.
Right. Back in my day.
You had to plug a phone line into the computer, and then it made this horrible sound. And like it's funny because like I for a little while I was teaching a course at a university here in New Jersey, Centenary University, and their social media studies program, which is pretty cool that they set that up. But like every successive class that I had would less and less understand the cultural references that I would make.
Oh, yeah.
It hurt me a little bit more every year. I'm like, all right, we're gonna do the Ferris Bueller thing. Like, who gets it?
Yeah, and then eventually it's just kind of over the head, and it really hurts your heart. Yeah.
It does, yeah, and like payphones and things like that. But thinking about like technology and so we were kind of on the cusp of that. So like in high school, for example, or even early college, like smartphones were starting to become a thing that more and more people had. They were starting to get faster, easier to use. So we kind of got to see the evolution of what that looks like. Now kids are born with access to the internet in the palm of their hands if they can get their hands on, and then from a very young age too. So I think there's a lot of difference between how much information is available to to younger generations now, that in some way, I mean, for better or for worse, right? There are definitely downsides to all of that. Like we've seen all of the studies about mental health and social media, but on the positive side, sometimes, right, if you can get accurate information on social media, you do also have access to news, and in some ways may even be a little bit more well-informed than my generation was, even if we were trying, right? Like I honestly didn't know very many people who would read the newspaper in high school. I mean, some of us would like browse the headlines and stuff like that, or try the New York for fun. They try the New York Times crossword puzzle on Friday, which was like the big challenge for some of us. But so I think there's the engagement. It's a number of things, but I think there's more on there. I think there are some great sort of activists or representatives in those younger generations, Gen Z, millennials, who are showing that engagement is a good thing ultimately, and getting out there and voicing voicing your concerns about whatever is going on is a good thing. So I think that's the positive. Now, on the flip side of that, to your question about how do we engage younger people in the political process, so take all of those things, right? Like access to information, this ability to almost get anything that you want sort of instantaneously. The political process and the process in government can be extraordinarily frustrating.
Yeah.
Extraordinarily frustrating because it's slow. I mean, like you noted, right? So you were sort of smack dab in the middle of these sort of like massive cultural shifts in your time, in the military, and that happens. It feels like it's happening quickly, but it's actually like a very kind of slow, deliberate process, because there are steps that you need to go through. And in this country, we have separation of powers, at least at the national level, where you have an executive, you have Congress, you have the Supreme Court, and those three branches don't always move along in unison. Often don't, in fact, at this point. Even the two houses of Congress don't move along. So I think that can be very frustrating. And when you're hearing about all these issues like climate change, for example, and as a younger person, you're thinking, well, things are getting weird now, right? Like extreme weather, fires. Like, I mean, we had this horrible, orange smoke descend upon, the New York sort of metro area for.
Thanks, Canada. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Can you just put that out, actually?
Right. Yeah.
But like, you can kind of understand why there might be some frustration. So it's like, okay, I voted. Now where's the change?
Right. Why hasn't anything changed?
Right. And I will say that like things do change and have changed. It's not at the pace that I think is satisfying in the sense that people want it to be. So I think that's a difficulty. In terms of communicating, though, like just from a brass tacks perspective, tactically, the one I can tell you what not to do is like the one thing that I see often are these really like ham-fisted ways of certain politicians or campaigns or advocacy groups trying to communicate with younger voters in a way that they believe like it's almost. So I'll just back up a little bit. So as a millennial, right, for a while, it was like we were sort of studied like zoo animals, right? Like, the guys in the white lab coats sitting out there with their clipboards going, oh, what do the millennials want? What does the millennial think? It's like in the wild, the millennial gets an avocado toast and on a weekend. So, we sort of like spent a little bit of time under the microscope like that, but a lot of that analysis like misses like this idea of like authenticity. And
right.
Sometimes like as a candidate, you just don't have it. Right. And that's okay. Like you don't have to be everything to everyone. So like if you're trying to do like a TikTok trend and it just, you're not going to pull it off, don't be patronizing about it.
Yeah.
Just
don't do it.
Skip that part.
Right.
And do something else. Like there's some really good examples of I'm drawing a blank on the name. There's one member of Congress in particular that is good, very good on TikTok, but it's not because he's running around doing dances or trends or anything like that. He literally sits down in front of a camera and explains what his day was like in Congress. Right. So now if he tried to be like patronizing about it and was like, oh, I'm going to do a dance while I try to tell you what happened in Congress today, I don't think people would listen or pay attention for the right reasons. So I think like authenticity is extraordinarily important. If you can pull it off, though, if you can pull off like a culturally relevant way to speak to people, then absolutely do that. But you need to have the right messengers for that. Like a good messenger message fit is extraordinarily important there. So I think that's it. And then like, the other pieces are too, it's, attention spans are diminishing. Unfortunately, all of us. It's not just young voters, it's everybody. Like, Gen X or, baby boomers, sitting there on the phones while watching Netflix, while, listening to something on, the Alexa or whatever home, speaker you have. So I think that's the that's the other thing too, is keeping things kind of like concise and concrete for people. But I don't think there's any sort of magic way to speak to younger voters other than to just treat them with respect and to not be patronizing. And then you can kind of figure out how to go from there, because like I do think there is a genuine interest among younger voters in the issues. It's just a matter of like getting past all the barriers to like have those conversations. And then the one big fight though, I think, is really like fighting apathy. Because it does feel like, okay, I voted now, like I said before, like now what? Like nothing happened, or and that can be frustrating.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
yeah.
It seems like the two extremes, as with anything, gets all the attention. It's either, like severe apathy or just so incredibly passionate about it. It's just like on the extreme level. And now we're going to just, glue our hands to the pavement or something like that, because I don't want, traffic to be able to drive by. Just it seems like the two extremes really are what gets all of the attention. And then you have this core group of young adults who are genuinely interested in what's going on, but it's kind of hard to get through that noise. I mean, I know I taught public speaking and human communication for about 18 years at the college level. And at the end of the day, one of the things that I learned from all of those students over all of those years is, who doesn't want to feel acknowledged? Who doesn't want to feel like they're being listened to? And even if you have a disagreement about something, if you can just listen so that you can understand where they're coming from. And this is something that has been reinforced that as a media analyst, working with so many other analysts, we come to the table, we're reading all these news and we're rating the news for reliability and bias. And we don't always agree depending on what it is that we're reading. But we really do have to take that moment to understand, that let's give the space for this person to be able to really express how they're thinking about this and ask the questions that they need to ask in an environment where you're not going to just kind of everybody pile on them because they're asking a question. And I think, for young people, just from having these conversations with them in the classroom, for many of them, I know they have had that experience where it's just, they're feeling less and less inclined to have those types of conversations because it is so loud. And, and if you don't agree with someone, there's this fear of, oh, now I'm going to be canceled, or now I'm going to be called out, or I'm going to end up on somebody's TikTok, or, something bad is going to result from this. And, so that's really challenging, I think, for young adults to try to navigate through this world that we've developed, with technology and social media and all of the emotions that are coming with it. It's so incredibly challenging. I do not envy being a young person in today's day and age of technology and in the current political climate. It's I'm sure it's not easy for them. I have a daughter who is 25 and a son who is 26, and I hear it from them all the time about how challenging it is to have these types of conversations, amongst themselves. Do you have you been a part of any polls that have talked to young people to kind of gauge how are they feeling about their ability to just express, what they're thinking about different topics of the day, and whether or not they're confident that they can express their feelings or their thoughts, without fear of being canceled or called out, on social media?
Yeah, I haven't seen any polling specifically on that issue of ability to express oneself. The question really is like, what is the outlet for that? So is it the act of voting, simply, which can be a very public or very quiet sort of thing, depending on how you do it. It could be activism on social media, or activism in real spaces. I think overall, as long as I think most people have a good sense of how to have a conversation that doesn't evolve into, and you make a really good point. I think that applies to all voters, not just like younger voters, is that like the extremes or anger, whenever you disagree with someone, from our perspective, right, this is one of the hardest things, because like obviously, or maybe not so obvious to folks that are listening, is that like when you work in the political sphere, you often pick a side and you choose the side that you most agree with, ultimately. So personally, I have some very strong opinions about certain things. Those are my opinions. And then there's a broad spectrum of things that fall within a range of things that I find to be productive for society, for our country. And I believe these things for reasons that, I can get into. However, I will say this. The hardest thing is trying to not come to a conversation with bringing those ideas and then looking at the person across the table for me. And if they say like simply like, I just don't agree with you, saying, well, you're an idiot and here's why.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that shuts it down immediately. Right.
Exactly.
And I think that's part of the issue, is because like a lot of our political discourse does in fact happen at a sort of mass communication level, where it's hard to have those engagements, whereas, if you're doing, canvassing, knocking on doors, you can kind of get into these like deeper conversations, where it's like, you really look at like two different voters from two different sides of the political spectrum, but like there is a lot in common for most people, where there's overlap. And in fact, a lot of the policies that someone is supporting may in fact be good for the person who doesn't think that they support those policies for whatever reason, because they're looking at it through a partisan frame. So, but to get back to the idea of like younger people being able to express themselves, again, I think, you do see in polling, focus groups, things like that, like frustration that not even certain candidates, but just like in general, like our political system isn't really giving voice to them, right? And no one's actually like effectively, I don't want to say nobody, but very few people are actually carrying what they would consider to be their voice in the political process, which kind of is an interesting thing. And again, I think this applies to all voters too, is we've almost gotten away from, I don't want to say almost, because we really have gotten away from yes, policy matters, like what you stand for. So like in an ideal world, if you're evaluating two candidates, you would look at policy positions for candidate A, policy positions for candidate B, and then you would go, I like this, and this, and this. And then on balance, you make the decision between the two. Increasingly, we found ourselves in a position where it's a vibes kind of based decision, right? All vibes. So you could have two, and you see this a lot during primary elections, right? Where you don't have that partisan frame actually. So you're not picking between a D or an R. You're picking between a D and a D, or an R and an R. And I think that gives you some interesting insights into how people consume political information, then give voice to their own concerns, or hope that someone else will give voice to their own concerns. Is that like a lot of those candidates and two of the major parties are going to have this like 95% overlap in their actual positions on policy. Right. Now, vibes, that's a different thing. Who's going to fight harder? Who is, more combative, or who's funnier, who's more energetic, or, I mean, there are all sorts of things that people evaluate as a part of the communication process. So that all adds up to kind of an interesting thing, is like, even if you do have a candidate who does or who does support a lot of policies that younger voters might like, there may be this disconnect because of that vibes problem, right? Like they're just not communicating themselves in a way that is satisfying in today's kind of media environment, right? It's not snappy enough. It's not, funny enough. It's not irreverent enough, whatever it is. So, but that's not an indictment of any particular age group or voter. It really is just the reality of how we all consume media today. And again, I think we can get to a place where, we can communicate effectively, like as long as you're thinking about your message and how you're delivering that message in the messenger. But like, I don't know. It definitely is an interesting thing. So I think it's kind of like an inconclusive thing. Like I can't give you an exact answer on like, do young voters feel like they can communicate in a way that will, where they can have debates and then not get canceled for certain viewpoints.
Right.
I tend to be a little bit more of an optimist on this front. Like, I think if you're careful about how you phrase things, that you can have the debate.
Yeah.
And not find yourself in hot water. But, there has to be some degree of empathy as well.
Right.
Which I think is missing. But again, that's like on a one-on-one sort of level. It's hard to communicate empathy on a mass communication level. I mean, some people can do it really well, but for the most part, it's just like on a one-on-one conversation, sitting around the, lunch table and, at your college's cafeteria or something.
Yeah.
If you communicate with empathy, I think you'll be okay. But I don't know if people realize that. Like, I'm not sure. I haven't seen, hard numbers on.
Yeah. But no, I think you're onto something. With the experiences that we've had as analysts coming together to discuss difficult topics, one of the advantages, I think, of kind of putting us into this weird experiment, if you will, where you're talk about the news, you're forced to talk about the news, and now you got to, see if you can agree on it, or at least, arrive at some understanding of where you think it is, on the political bias and how reliable it is. You don't know where your own blind spots are. And this is going to lead to a question I'm really curious about for you. We come to the table and we're all very clear about our political positions. We always have a right lean, a left lean, and a center, and everybody knows what everybody else is, where they land on the political spectrum. And that's what helps drive our conversations in an authentic way. And then, oh, wow, I would have never even thought about that, in that particular story, because that's not even my perspective. So we're learning a lot about our own blind spots and how to have these conversations about difficult topics. But we're also realizing, at least, this has been my experience, I'm a conservative. So as a conservative, who is an analyst, when I come to the table and I'm reading the news, I have to constantly remind myself it's not my job to advocate for a position right now. It's my job to read this article and to determine whether this article is advocating for a position. And so you really do have to work to separate your personal feelings and your personal beliefs and your political beliefs from, being able to do that job. Is that something similar for what you do in your world of political campaigning? Or because you are in the world of political campaigning, you are able to take your own personal beliefs and political beliefs and allow that to be a driver for how you're working with different candidates?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question too. So I think that there's a pretty broad spectrum of how people in my position handle that. So some people definitely, and I think, I get the sense that we may be actually on opposite sides of the political spectrum, even, which is good. Actually, I think this is a really cool, cool way to have a conversation, because like we started out having, which I think is actually a good demonstration of like how you can get to like actual interesting information, or at least some common viewpoints, or at least have a compelling conversation about something. Is you start off like actually having a conversation about things without like looking through those lenses. But yeah, I mean, I'm definitely on the opposite side of the political spectrum. Everyone kind of handles it a little bit differently. Like there's some who are like ideological purists who, like I said, you usually pick a side, right? So if you're working on one side, there's not that much variance, but there is some, right? Like there definitely is some. So you do have, consultants who will only work with like the most, like I guess what you would consider the most progressive candidates,
Yeah.
whereas, some consultants will work with anyone on the Democratic side of the aisle, and some will work with more centrist candidates or whatever. I personally think, like, I don't believe, generally speaking, for the most part, that my specific personal viewpoint on things is super relevant to working with clients, because like I think if you take a step back, you realize that you agree again with 95% of what anybody is saying in any particular race, and then at least from my perspective, you try to work with people that you feel are going to do the right thing, are going to advocate in the right ways, and actually be able to affect the kind of change that you want to see, as opposed to sometimes bluster, right? Like there's a little bit, and that can be, again, very satisfying, but it's not always the best way to get stuff done. So so from my perspective, I will say that we always kind of like look through the lens of certain values, like lines we don't cross, generally speaking. But I think beyond that, my personal political views are not especially relevant. I mean, what we're bringing to the table ultimately is we're professionals, right? So we have to work with our clients to develop a message that we think is going to help them. So that's the other thing where I think this comes in, because like the way that I think about the world in terms of my own personal political views may not be the most effective way to communicate, to convince someone on the other side of the aisle even that my candidate is the right candidate for the job. Oftentimes it wouldn't be, right? Because I think, like, again, if you get into your own sort of like hyper partisan like brain, like I'd be
absolutely. I have a friend who is a lawyer here. I'm located in Savannah, Georgia, and he contacted me. This was several years ago. He said, "Hey, I know someone who is running for Congress for the first district, and I think you two really should be in contact with each other, because I think you have a lot in common, despite the fact that you are, on different sides of the political aisle, just as far as your moral foundations and, and all of those things." So I was like, okay, yeah, I'll chat with her. And we met several times, and mutually, respectful, had a lot of really good, meaningful conversations. But at the end of the day, I mean, even though we could agree on some of those really core values that we were talking about, when it came to, okay, how are we going to express those values? What type of actions, what type of policies, would I support in order to bring that to light? That's where we saw the vast differences. And it ended up being that, we had to separate, part ways, because it just, we couldn't get to that point where we could arrive at the agreements, everything from, certain terminology to use, to who to reach out to have conversations. Cause, of course, from my perspective, I'm like, let's get you in front of some, conservative focus groups and pick their brains and see what is it that, and it just at the end of the day, it just didn't work. And, nothing negative toward her or her beliefs. It was just, it was a really interesting experience, to have that. So that's why I'm so fascinated by what you do in your sphere, and whether or not that is a part of it, having to separate your own ideology from, who you're working with.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, the other thing that is, I think, worth noting too is like we're not building candidates from scratch, right? Like we don't go into a laboratory and take a drop of this, a drop of that, and then put it in the machine, and out pops some candidate who's an exact an exact, like 3D printed.
Right. Here's your perfect liberal. Here's your perfect conservative. Right.
Right. And you're going to say all the right things, and you're going to you're not going to have any problems whatsoever, and you're going to be totally personable while also like very thoughtful. It's so that's not a real thing, right? Like
Yeah.
these are people who also come to the table with their own ideas. So it's not like we are like, there are moments where you work with candidates and they're like, I'm thinking really hard about X issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I need some ideas about how best to approach this. Like, here's the outcome. Here are the values that I want to bring to solving this problem. But I just don't know the best way to get there. So this is why I have advisors around me. Whereas sometimes, right, like a candidate will come and say, like, I have a very, very specific viewpoint on something.
Yeah.
And even though it's focus grouped and like, you do the polling and you talk to voters and it's maybe not the best thing to be talking about, but at the end of the day, the candidate is the candidate, right? And our job is to give the best possible advice. And then if there's something that they feel strongly about, which is really, honestly, they should, right? They should feel strongly about things.
I would hope so. Yeah.
Right? It's not
Have
just
some passion.
Right, exactly. It's not just some like exercise in saying what I think you want me to say. It's
right.
I have to sell my ideas and my thoughts and myself to you. So in those circumstances, we'll put aside even our professional advice and then develop whatever framework to best deliver that specific viewpoint or message as well. So there's a little bit of like having to take a step back and like you cannot get too wrapped up in like how you feel emotionally too, because like you can't also, you're not a focus group of one either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I mean, if you're just doing this day in and day out, like you need to get out and talk to other people, like
right.
and not live in your own head with this stuff.
I imagine that's a tough balancing act though, for politicians, the struggle between saying what you think your constituency wants to hear versus saying what you actually believe. So I imagine that's really difficult, how to balance that because, as someone who consumes, I have a healthy, I think, skepticism for when I'm listening to political candidates. I'm always in the back of my mind wondering, are you telling me what you think I want to hear? Or are you being real with me right now? And I imagine a lot of people feel the same way, especially in today's climate with politicians, and they don't exactly have the best reputations, with things that are happening, in the political sphere. So do you ever have candidates that have that conversation with you, that balance between, oh man, but I know my constituency wants this, but I want that. And how do I rectify that?
Yeah, I mean, that is a conversation that you have. And I think at the end of the day, and this is sort of where I kind of like, we draw lines on certain things, is that sometimes like a constituency will want something that is entirely in contravention to what you believe democracy is all about, like the fundamental fabric of this country, right? The idea that we have elections, that the results of the elections then pick the winners, like it or not, and that calling those sorts of things into question is extraordinarily dangerous, because it undermines everything on every side of middle, right, center, whatever it is, left.
Absolutely.
Undermines everything. So in terms of like issues like that, where we're talking about like the very fabric of our democracy, and we don't run into this a lot with our clients, but like I know it happens, and I hear it from other people too. It's like, we just don't, like, you can't, like, that's my position, is like, you cannot. So even if your constituency wants to hear like you call into question something that is going to be fundamentally, have a deleterious effect on democracy or elections or our institutions, don't do it.
Yeah.
Like, that's the area that we kind of draw the line. With everything else though, it's like, all right, like, are we going to talk about, fiscal policy or monetary policy, really like boring kind of stuff sometimes, but from those perspectives, right, like, I think there's always a way to take what the candidate believes and then take a look at where the electorate is and develop a frame that helps people get through the door. So this is actually a conversation that we have with a lot of our clients. It's like, okay, what areas do we have to meet people where they are? And then what areas do we have to lead?
Yeah.
And you can't do it all the time, right? You cannot lead people from one place to another in each issue, because it's just not how, I mean, there's not an infinite amount of time and resources to do that. So, so you have to make decisions about the things that you're going to try to lead people, pick your issues, and then try to shift the Overton window on those types of things. And sometimes they're tiny shifts. I mean, sometimes it's not that big a leap from what you think is the best thing based on all of the experts and policy and research that you've done and what the electorate wants to hear. So I think, again, it's so that is a conversation that we do have. It's like, how do we get there? But I do think a lot of it has to do not so much with the core substance of a message, but the framing of the message that can make a world of difference in how people are hearing what you're saying. So I think there is a way to do it. We've done it. We do it all the time. Just trying to reconcile those views, because it's, again, and it really is about taking that step back and saying, okay, I hear what you're saying, and I hear what the candidate is saying, and it's like, are they really even so different, though?
Right.
Are they even so different? And most of the time, the answer is no. It's really not so different. It's just like, let's tweak the frame with which we're talking about this particular issue, and I think people are going to get it. So that is something that we do talk about frequently.
Yeah. I appreciate your point that you made as well. I mean, at some point you do have to think about, the topics of the day and what are the constituents, believing in, and what are they talking about, and what do they want to hear. And, I know at least from, my point of view, when I hear someone, and people who, I've known for a very, very long time, fellow conservatives, that they're still insisting that the 2020 election was stolen. And I'm like, can we please just stop? Stop. Let's just, and so if there's a politician that wants to feed into that, for me, I immediately will just close my ears, because fundamentally, I think there's something wrong with perpetuating, that idea. So I think it's, I don't know, at least on my side of the aisle, I think we have a lot of challenges moving forward with our politicians, because they're having to make some hard decisions on, am I going to placate this very loud group over here? Or am I going to, come over here and talk with this group? That's one of the things that when I was watching the midterm elections, and then, all the conversations that were surrounding what was happening here in Georgia with Governor Kemp, and Raffensperger, and then, the thing that happened with Trump. I will have to say, I was so incredibly relieved when I was, okay, my governor has kind of stood his ground. Our Secretary of State stood his ground, and I was very happy, with him doing that. But there were a lot of conservatives who are in the Trump camp who were not, happy with that at all. So it's just from my perspective, it's really interesting looking at the candidates that are coming out and what are the choices that they are making on who they want to, I guess, speak to, and kind of get them in their camp. It's what a time. What a crazy time.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And there are a lot of challenges. And the one thing that I like to say is anger is easy, right? That's it's an activating emotion, right? So it's once you tap into that anger, it's easy. It's a little bit addicting. It can kind of bring you back to that place where people feel aggrieved, or something didn't quite go right, or something was wrong during the election, and all of that. But both of us know is not true, right? Everything, it was probably one of the most secure elections in the history of elections. People were watching in a way that was never done before. So clearly there wasn't an issue, but again, that anger over nobody likes to lose. I mean, that's a big thing, and it's kind of come to feel so existential that the stakes feel like they're so high that like it is easy to tap into that anger. To your point though, it is possible to push back, and like admittedly I was definitely rooting for the other side in the
Yeah.
race, but I will say this, like I do think the governor probably did get, at least in the general election, a little bit of credit even from some Democrats if you look at the numbers.
Right.
That he did take a stand. Now, do they agree with him on any other policy? Maybe not, but like there are some very fundamental things in our political system that I think are just inviolable, right? You just should not touch it. And they're being violated every day, unfortunately, in some ways. So it is a tough way to conduct campaigns, because I'm sure. Actually, well, I don't want to say I'm sure. I'm positive, and you hear this, in the back channels of, sort of consultant world, right? Like candidates on the other side of the aisle, like a lot of them want to be talking about something else.
Yeah,
they want to be talking about something else, and they just feel like they can't. And you see, it's like toxic. It is very toxic in the general election to still be doing the election denial stuff,
right?
So. But like everyone's like, well, how do we get away from this? How do we get away from this? Or we're going to start moving away from, and then they just can't for some reason, or something prevents them. It's really an electoral issue, right? They're afraid of losing their seat.
Exactly.
And no one's ready to take that plunge, or they, dip their toe in the water, and they get bitten by the piranha, and then they quickly pull the toe. Like, whoa, don't want to do that. So it's, I don't envy that position that a lot of folks on the other side of the aisle are in. Other than to say that, like, I think at some point, like, there has to be a decision to just be like, we're not going to do this anymore. Like, we have a bunch of core issues that we want to focus on, so let's do that. And again, I'm not saying I agree with them or I think they're even necessarily good for America, but like, I think it's better for America than debating the very foundations of whether or not we want democracy in this country. Because I think the answer is yes, we do, because the alternative is not good.
Yeah. And, and to your point, about anger and those heightened emotions that, that they certainly are a driver. And we've seen this, just looking at the media that we're consuming. I don't know if you're familiar with the media bias chart, but that's who I'm a media analyst with. And one thing that we've noticed, just by even looking at the media bias chart, is a vast, there's just so much of media that's consumed that falls below this line of, what we consider to be high quality news. And then there's just so much that falls below that line into the lower quality news. And there's logical fallacies and ad hominem and, boogeyman, and it's us versus them mentality. And it's that driver. And if you're someone that is, all you're doing is you're consuming, those hyper partisan type of media sources, and, on either side, because we see it on both sides, of course you become even more embedded in that identity of, what it means to be a progressive or a liberal or a Republican, or a patriot, those labels that we like to call ourselves. And we have no idea about the conversations that are happening on the other side. And it's confirmation bias all over the place. It's a really difficult thing to try to transcend, getting people out of their, they're embedded. They really do get embedded in those identities. And I'm sure it's very difficult. For candidates, do you often give them advice on particular sources that would be better to stay away from versus sources that would be better to, this will be a good source to get your word out? Do y'all do that as well with your advice that you give them?
Absolutely. I think there are a number of factors that go into it. So there are certain candidates who are just really good. So everyone kind of brings a different skill set to the table too. So you have some candidates who are really good with, you know, in interviews, some that are really good on the stump, you know, at rallies and things like that. Some that are just like maybe not so good at those two things, but you put them in a diner with a group of voters and they're going to knock it out of the park because they can connect on that one-on-one level. So you kind of have to know who you're working with at that point. So in some cases, like our inclination is like, if you have to win, you know, a general election in most places, I have no problem with candidates going on news, you know, or engaging with news sources that are, or not even necessarily like news sources, but also like, when I say news, I mean also commentary too, because like a lot of these it's just commentary.
That's like the vast majority of it.
Right. It's not really hard news. It's commentary masquerading as hard news. And so I'll say like you absolutely can. You just have to be prepared for it. You have to not get sort of into an emotional tangle over it, because like the job of the host, and I think this is one of the things that like was interesting to learn, you know, getting into this business, is that journalists, commentators, you know, opinion columnists, they all have a job to do, and that job is not my job. Right. They're not here to make my life easier, or the candidate's life easier. Right. And so once you realize that, you're like, okay, like, can you really get offended by like a negative news story here, negative news story there? It's like, no, they're doing their job. Now, the question is, do you want your narrative to be a part of that story, or do you want to be completely left out of it? And I think there are good arguments for most of the time. Yes, you do want your narrative to be a part of that story, even if it's going to have a negative tilt. As long as you go in there with good humor and you engage in good faith and have your answers and viewpoints really sharp, then I think you're okay. Like, I think it's going to be okay, and you should do that. There are times where I would say, no, like, do not engage with a particular news source or commentator, strictly because like they have showed repeated bad faith. Like, they're just not interested. Like, they'll continue to interrupt you. They'll try to, you know, create some sort of issue. And like, if you're not ready for that, then, or it's just like, it's so blatantly ridiculous that, that it's almost insurmountable, no matter how good you are in an interview, then I would say, like, you know what, not worth going on there, because they're just their agenda is very clear. It's not to
absolutely
it's, you know, roll over you. There was an interesting thing though, recently, was it Gavin Newsom on, was it Hannity, I think? That interview was really interesting, right? So like, I think in that case, like but again, like I don't love Hannity, right? Like, obviously.
Right. Yeah. The conventional wisdom you would think would be like, maybe that's not the best use of your time.
Exactly. Exactly. But I think like the thing is, like, if you can do it and go in there and keep your cool, and I think Gavin Newsom did a great job of doing that. And like Pete Buttigieg does it all the time on the Democratic side of the aisle as well on Fox News. You know, he's very measured and is able to deliver a message like that. And again, it depends on like what position you're into. So like being like a cabinet secretary or a governor or a senator or member of Congress is also different than being the president of the United States too. Like, there's a certain like dignity at the presidential level that, like, you know, you can actually pick and choose a little bit more, but lower down on the ladder, I think you can be a little bit more flexible and perhaps adventurous with stuff like that. But the Hannity episode, I mean, you have to, like, there are people who listen to Hannity who have not heard the Democratic viewpoint on anything.
Right.
And it's probably a good thing that they do actually hear that. Whether or not they buy it at the end, totally different question. But so I wouldn't say there's like a hard and fast rule that we approach things with, but we do have the conversation. I'm always inclined to, like, the more you can engage, the better off you're going to be, ultimately, because you're going to be reaching people. And that also is a function of how fragmented our media landscape is. So it's not like you can just go on Cronkite and reach 80% of the country anymore. You have to, like, figure out, like, okay, well, you have some people watching CNN, some people are watching MSNBC, some people are watching Fox and on you know, on the cable, and still that's all of those combined, it's still a small fraction of the overall population of the country. And then you have some people who are still reading newspapers, but then a lot of people are looking at their phones or, checking, well, it's not, what is it, Twitter, X, Twitter, whatever.
I think it's X now.
X Twitter. It's like literally
Yeah.
was once Twitter, but now is X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. But people are looking at their platform. So it's a matter of trying to be everywhere, right? And that's really tough. Even podcasts, right? Like, they're really great. I mean, you have a loyal audience of people who listen to you. It's great to be on podcasts. If you can manage to do that. So I am inclined to say, like, go on everything. Don't be super defensive about stuff and just get out there and
just know what you're getting into.
Yeah,
be
exactly.
Prepared for that.
Exactly.
Yeah. I got to tell you, Matt, this has been, at least for me, I don't know about you listeners, but for me, this has been an awesome conversation. I've really enjoyed this. I can't believe we've actually been talking for, it's been a good hour now already. That time has just flown by. I do want to go ahead and wrap up, but before I do, I wanted to ask your opinion or if you have any advice for our listeners. We are getting into 2024 and we already know election season it's here. Okay. I'm just gonna say it's here. There's no gearing up for 2024. We're already geared up. So what type of advice would you have for our listeners, going into this next election cycle, as far as the being consumers of communication? What advice do you have for them as far as, how to listen, what to listen to, what to listen for, anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are two sort of parallel tracks of advice that I would give. So the first is communicating in your personal life around some of these issues, because it's going to be present like every day for a lot of us in a lot of different places, whether it's the workplace or at home or with neighbors or friends. And then there's the consuming the news piece, like you said. And I think in both of those parallel tracks, just from a consumer perspective, it's best to acknowledge or observe your emotion when you're reading something or hearing something, and take a minute and be like, okay, like, I'm angry about this. All right, I see that. Why? Like, what about this makes me angry? And then if you don't have a good answer to that, or missing a part of the puzzle, like, go look somewhere else for an answer. Look in a place that you wouldn't normally, in a news source that you normally wouldn't consume. Try to figure it out. Also, like, I do want to just say this too, and I'm sure you see this all the time too. Like, there are just like junk sources of information on the internet.
Oh, absolutely.
Just junk, like absolute junk. And no amount of like both sidesing, like, oh, well, this side or that side is ever going to make those outlets any better. It's just junk. It's garbage. There's nothing in there that's going to be any of use. And if you're, really digging down to the bottom of the Google barrel there, you're not going to find anything of use, right? So, but there are, again, like, for better or for worse, like, most of the major news outlets out there have some degree of credibility and editorial standards that you can kind of count on. And looking at the different bent of different things, you can find information. So I would say, like, look in places that you wouldn't normally look, but avoid like the really like crazy, like anything that sounds like excessively nuts. For the most part, could be totally nonsense. So take a minute before you go ahead and slam that share button on Facebook and share whatever meme or thing that you see there onto your own timeline. So that's the advice that I would give, is like, kind of observe your emotions a little bit on how you're responding to things, because I think like we it's so automatic when we're reading something that, like, you feel the anger, but then you don't actually like recognize that you're angry about it. And then that thumb is moving toward that share button right there.
That's right. That's right. There's something in that article that is causing you to feel a certain way. So to be able to kind of analyze that for a little bit and look at it like, what is it about this? I think that's fantastic advice. I mean, that's what we have to do. As soon as we find that, you know what, I feel a bit triggered at the moment. What's going on here? Let's pick this apart. I see. Look at the language that's being used. There's a lot of political positioning happening in here. And so I think that's wise advice. As consumers of communication, we just have to be mindful of what it is that we're taking in. You're right. There's a lot of junk out there. We got to be mindful of that. I don't think having a slight bias is inherently bad. I mean, that's what makes democracy, right? I mean, we will have differences of ideas of how to move forward with certain, policies, but that's the beauty of it. We should be able to talk about those things. Having different perspectives is critical in a democracy, I think. But yeah, if we can stay away from the hyperpartisan stuff, I think we'll all be better for it. So, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your wisdom and your experience in this field. I think political communication is just endlessly fascinating. I'm just so happy that we were able to have this conversation, and I know the listeners got a lot out of it as well. It's just I've truly enjoyed having you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it too. So
yeah,
it's fun to talk about this stuff.
Anybody who is interested in following up with you or learning more about your organization, how can they do so?
We're using LinkedIn a lot these days. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Matt Krayton, Krayton. It's an unusual spelling, so I think I might be the only Matt Krayton spelled that way on the planet. So there you go, super easy to find. You can also find Publitics, which has, we have some more sort of corporate focused insights on various communication issues on there on that feed. So you can find us on LinkedIn, on the website, and we're starting to get into threads too a little bit. So if you
that's going to be an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll see if it's got staying power. We'll see. But we're giving it a shot. So yeah, those are the spots on the web that you can find us. And again, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure that we have all those links in the show notes for everyone. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed today's show. I know I did, and I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day. All right, y'all take care now.